the praise and the glory for it. Well, this morning as we continue to look at the story of Gideon's life, we will see how his life teaches us these things. And the first thing that we see is that faith changes you. Now, when last week we left off right in the middle of the story of his life. But where we left off, if you remember, God had told Gideon, go down and attack the camp. But if you're afraid, then you can go with your servant and go down and listen to what the people are saying, what the soldiers are saying. And so Gideon was afraid. He went down there, he listened to what the soldiers were saying, and they were talking about a dream. One of them had a dream about the loaf of bread that rolled down and knocked down a tent. And the other one interpreted or understood what it meant, that Gideon was going to come with his small army of 300 and destroy the entire camp of the Midianites. Well, this is where we pick up our story then, in chapter 7, verse 15. It says, as soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And so the first response we see here, Gideon's very first response to hearing this dream, to hearing what God is going to do, is to worship. I think that's a perfect response. But why does he worship? Because he knows that God is going to do what he has said he's going to do. And he responds by praising God. So apparently he trusts him now. He has faith that God is going to do this, and he praises God. The second thing is he takes his very small army into battle. He goes back to the camp and he tells them to get ready. And he devises this plan. And he divides his 300 men into 3 groups of 100. And they each get a trumpet, a jar, a clay jar, and a torch. And he tells the men this. He says, look at me. And he says, and do as I do. You see, at this point, Gideon is leading the people. He's believing that God will come through for them, and he's leading the people to go forward and do this crazy thing. 300 people attacking this huge army. And he gives them a battle cry. And the battle cry is simply this, for the Lord and for Gideon. Now, some people read this and they think that at this point Gideon is taking part of the credit. Because for the Lord and Gideon. And the reason why they get that idea is because of what's going to happen later, what we're going to see later. But I think at this point, it's more likely that he's actually, that he's not doing that. But given the fact that he's acting in faith right now, that he's really just showing his complete allegiance to God. And that they're together, to the Lord and Gideon. They're working together. And later on, his words are going to give full credit to God. And so I think at this point, this battle cry, he's basically saying that he is totally on board with God. God is the commanding officer, and Gideon is working as his lieutenant, carrying out his work. So let's keep reading in verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. When the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke their jars, they held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hand the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah towards Zerah, and as far as the border of Abel Mohilah by Tabbath. Now, Gideon and his army, then they come and they sneak up to the edge of the camp. And they have their trumpets in hand, along with their torches that are in the clay jars in order to hide the lights, so they can successfully sneak up to the camp. And it's in the middle of the night. Now the three groups of 100, they go on different sides of the camp. And so they're surrounding the camp of this huge army. And following Gideon's lead, all 300, they raise those 300 torches, and they smash their jars, and they shout. Now, you need to remember, again, what time was it? It was the middle of the night. So that means most of the people in the Midianite camp were sleeping. Have you ever been suddenly jarred awake in the middle of the night by a loud noise? It's a little disorienting, right? And you kind of like sit up and you might have a little shortness of breath. You might be like, what was that? And you don't know what's going on, but it's sudden, it's surprising. And it's a strange feeling that happens to you. Very disorienting. But on top of that, on top of being startled and confused, they've heard this shout. And they correctly interpret this shout as a battle cry. For a sword for the Lord and Gideon. Another thing is the fact that they said sword now may make them think that Gideon's army actually has swords. They're standing there with torches and trumpets. But they jump up, and what they think when they hear this battle cry is that they're under attack. And when all the pots crash, all the jars crash down, what's that sound like? It sounds like chaos, and it sounds like there's something going on. And maybe they're thinking the people are right here in the camp, and there's everything, things are getting broken. We're under attack, they're here. And so they wake up in this startled, chaotic, half-awake, heightened emotional state. They all jump up out of bed and run and start fighting everyone they see. Well, who is around them but other people on their own side, other Midianites. But they start fighting each other, attacking each other. Because they think the Israelites are there in the camp. But they're not. They're actually lined up around the outer edge of the camp with their torches. Well, some of the Midianites manage to get out of the camp and they run. And so the Israelites pursue them. But before we go on to that, let me say this for a minute. At this point in the story, Gideon seems like a totally different person than he did earlier, than what we saw last week. Because what we saw last week is that he was that timid, full of doubt person, that person who was scared and hiding in the winepress in case the Midianites might come and take the stuff. And he was that person who was skeptical, wasn't sure about God, and is God really going to do what he said? At this point, he seems very different. He's very confident. He's boldly going into battle. He boldly moves out. But not only that, but he's able to lead other people into battle as well. Think about this for a minute. He was able to convince those 300 men to go up and fight this army of thousands, carrying torches and trumpets and jars. But he said, God is going to do this. And he convinced them to have faith in God and go do this. And so Gideon is acting like a person of faith. He's ready to do it. He believes that God will give him the victory, and he leads these people into this battle. He's acting like a person of faith. Believing God, recognizing God's power, he will do what he said he will do. He's trusting him and leading these others. But see, this is what faith does. Faith, when we live by faith, when we have complete confidence in God, it changes you. It changes how you think, it changes how you act, and it gives you the ability to face even things that seem impossible. And even the ability to lead others into the impossible. Well, as Gideon pursues the enemy, he's going to run into a couple different groups of Israelites who are not really on the same page with him. So let's see how he responds. Chapter 7, verses 23. It says, and the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them, as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. They were named after the places where they were killed. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. Chapter 8, verse 1 says, then the men of Ephraim said to him, what is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian? And they accused him fiercely. And he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. So as they're pursuing the Midianites, they call all the other Israelites to come out and help them in the pursuit. And Gideon sends these messages to the men of the tribe of Ephraim to come and help. And he tells them, hurry down and basically to cut off their escape route before they can get across the rivers. And so into their own land. So he says, so they do that. They come down and they cut off the escape route so they can't get away. They go and they catch and kill the two Midianite leaders in that group, and then they come back and bring the heads with them to Gideon. Basically evidence to show that they really did kill these two men. But here's the thing I think about when I read this. I'm not sure if Gideon was supposed to do what he just did, to call these others out to help. I mean, if you remember last week, God shrunk that army for a reason. He told Gideon before, when he had 32,000 people, you have way too many men in this army. Send them home. Anyone who's scared, send them home. And so he sent down home 20,000 of them. And then he said, you still have too many. And so he did that little test with the drink, and he sent those home. And he ends up with 300 men. And God purposely wanted this group to be small so that there was no question about who gave the victory. So there wasn't any thought that the men on their own were able to win this victory, but that God handed them this victory. And at this point, Gideon calls these men, and they come and they join in the fight. I'm just not quite sure if he was supposed to have done that. I mean, there's nothing said here nothing negative said here about what he's done. But if you'll notice in the story, what we've just read and what we read from the rest of the account is that God is silent. God's no longer talking to Gideon. We don't hear anything from him. So it makes me wonder. But when these men from Ephraim come to Gideon, they complain and they criticize him. Their complaint is, why didn't you call us sooner? Well, the reason for that is because God told them to send people home. God said, I want you to have the small army. And Gideon could have simply said, because God told me not to. But he doesn't. But the Ephraimites, they feel slighted, as if they were kind of like Gideon's last option, and you only called us when you needed us, when you had to. But Gideon basically just says, you have no reason to be offended. I mean, you did great things in battle, and you have the honor that is due to you for what you've done. In fact, he says, you've done, and maybe buttering him up a little bit, flattering him a little here. He says, in fact, you've done far greater things than I have. And he used the illustration of grapes. He says, aren't the grapes that you harvest in Ephraim far better than the grapes that you harvest in my homeland? And he's just using that as an example, saying, oh, you guys are way better than me. You guys are way more important, or way better quality. And he says, you've done all of this. You've done better than I have. And then with these words, he smooths things out with the Ephraimites. And he basically handles their criticism fairly well. Just kind of says, hey, he's not too bothered by it. But again, I wonder, why didn't he just tell them, well, God told me to have a small army, not to call everyone out. This was God's plan. And I think at this point, Gideon has started to shift his focus onto himself rather than God. Let's continue reading chapter 8, verse 4. And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over it, and he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." And the officials of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand that we should give you bread?" In other words, are they? Have you already caught them? Why should we help you? Verse 7, so Gideon said, "Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." And from there he went on to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, "When I come again in peace," in other words, after winning the battle, "I will break down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogabah and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him. And he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, "Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted?' And he took the elders of that city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city." Now here we have an interesting turn of events. Gideon and his 300 men are chasing after the enemy. They're exhausted and they're hungry. They come across the town Succoth, which is an Israelite town. And he asks them for food because they're chasing the enemy kings. Of course, their answer is no, because you haven't yet won. You don't yet have them in your hands. You haven't caught them. That's the problem. Gideon hasn't won yet, at least not completely. Now think about this for a minute. If you were a town that was pretty close to the Midianite border, and these people had been oppressing you, and now the rebel Israelites are running through town saying, "Help us." Now you have a decision to make. Are we going to help the rebel Israelites and take the chance that they don't actually win and these kings might come back and take vengeance on us? And so you can understand where they're coming from, although obviously it's not a position of faith, believing in God to take care of them. But you could understand why they would say these things. Well, Gideon, when he hears the response, he promises to punish them when he captures these kings. He tells them, "I'm going to whip you with wild thorns," basically. And then he goes on to another town, Penuel, which is also an Israelite town, and they give him the same answer. And so Gideon promises to them, "I'm going to tear down your tower." Now the tower was the tower they used for defense, against their enemies when they would come against the city. He said, "I'm going to tear down your defenses, your tower." And when I read this, I think, does this seem right? I mean, Gideon's response to these Israelites, does it seem right? It seems to me like a response of anger and vengeance. It's like Gideon is saying, if you dishonor me, I'll show you. I'll get back at you. I'll teach you to dishonor me. But you also notice that there's no mention of God. No mention of the promise. He didn't say, "Well, give me bread." And they said, "No, you haven't already caught him?" And they say, "But we're going to, because God said we would win." No mention of it from Gideon. He just gets angry. Well, it goes on and tells us that Gideon and his 300 men, they take this different route and they catch up to the Midianites who are hiding, and they think they're secure. They think they've gotten to a place where they're safe. And so they're just hanging there, and the two kings are there with them. And they're resting, and while they're resting, Gideon catches up to them and he attacks them. And the two kings, they take off running. But he chases after them and captures them, and now Gideon can go get his revenge. So he's on his way back and he finds this young man from Succoth, and it's interesting because it says he captured him. And I think that's an interesting choice of words, and I think it's there on purpose. Because he just captured the enemy kings. And now what did he do to a fellow Israelite? Captured him. He's treating an Israelite like an enemy. But he interrogates him and gets all the information out of him that he needs and heads back to the town. And when he gets back to the town, he basically says to the people, "You mocked me, but look, I was successful." And he did what he said he would do. He grabs wild thorns and he whips them or thrashes them with them. But did you notice what it says? It says he did it to teach them a lesson. Now, what lesson did he teach them? I think the lesson was, don't mess with Gideon. Well, then he goes on to Penuel and he tears down their wall just like he said he would. But then it says something else. He says he also killed the men. Now, why did he do that? I don't know. Is it because they tried to defend their tower and they said, don't do it? Or was it just because Gideon was just angry and wouldn't stop and got carried away in his anger and went further than he even said he would? See, at this point now, Gideon, he's no longer that scared and insecure man that we saw last week. But he's also doesn't seem like the man of faith that we saw at the beginning of this. At this point, he's a man of vengeance and anger. You see, God called Gideon to come out and to get past his fears and to, in faith, to deliver Israel. But like I said earlier, God doesn't seem to be part of the story right now. At least he's not speaking to Gideon, and Gideon doesn't seem to be following very closely after God's ways. He seems to be acting on his own. So see, Gideon has become that mighty warrior, which is ironic because last week when he was hiding and fearful, God called him mighty warrior. Gideon has become a mighty warrior. But now he's turned against his own people. And in doing so, he's lost sight of what is right. The other thing I see is when Gideon questioned God, when he didn't trust God, said, "Are you really you? Are you really who you say you are? Are you really going to do this? Are you really going to rescue or save through me?" When Gideon questioned God, what did God do? He graciously gave Gideon what he needed in order to move along and grow in his faith. Now Gideon comes to these men who question him. And how does he respond? Not the same way, not with grace and patience like God did, but with anger. He gives them no such grace. And I think, those of us who have been shown grace, we should be able to show grace to others as well. If we have been given much grace, and we have, if you are a child of God, then you know the forgiveness you have been given. You know the grace you have been shown. We were enemies of God, sinners, cut off from Him. And Jesus came and died on the cross in our place so we could be forgiven. That is grace. We don't deserve it. We deserve judgment. But God gave us grace. And if we know that grace, then we should be able to show grace to others. And that's part of living by faith. Because we live knowing that God is going to take care of us, that God is going to do good things, that God is with us. And we can extend grace knowing that God will lead us and will take care of us. But at this point, Gideon has turned his focus on himself. And his selfish vengeance becomes even more evident after he asks these two Midianite kings a question. Look at verse 18 through 21. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" They answered, "As you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." And he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise and kill them." But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength." And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. And so at this point, Gideon finds out that these two kings and their men had killed his relatives, his family. And he claims that if they had spared his family, that he would spare their lives. But since they killed his family, then he will kill them as well. Now at this point, Gideon isn't just carrying out justice. He's taking vengeance. This has become a personal vendetta. Now, he gives his son, Gideon gives his son the opportunity to kill the men in Sid, but his son's too scared. And in all the hesitation, the two kings basically speak up. They're insulted because they're like, "Do you kill us?" In other words, they would be insulted to be killed by a timid, young man who's afraid. They want to be, if they're going to be killed, they want to be killed by a mighty warrior. And so they say to Gideon, "You kill us," which is ironic because just a couple days ago, Gideon was not a mighty warrior. He was the same scared, timid guy. But they say, "You kill us." So Gideon does. Kills them himself, and then he takes the ornaments that were the royal ornaments that were hanging on their camels. Now, Gideon seems to be operating here from a position of, you're okay as long as you're with me. In all three of these instances, where people have criticized him or come against him or complained, he operates from a position of like, you're okay as long as you're with me. First, the Ephraimites, they came and they complained at him, but they had shown loyalty to Gideon by going out. When he called them to battle, they went out and they caught those men and did what he had asked them to. And so he's like, okay, and he actually just smoothed things out with them and everything was fine. Then the men of Succoth and Penuel, they were not loyal to Gideon. And what did he do? He came back and he whips them with thorns and he killed even some of them, tear down their tower. Even though they were his extended family, the relatives, Israelites. And then we have these two enemy kings. Did you catch the word enemy kings? Okay, two enemy kings. And he tells them, I would have spared your life if you had treated me well. If you had not killed my family. It seems like he's willing to extend more grace to the enemy than to his own people. But at the same time, it's like, but since you crossed me, I'm going to take you out. By faith, we can keep our focus on God. And I think Gideon lost this. But by faith, we can keep our focus on God. And we can show grace and do what is right, even to those who criticize us. But it takes living by faith. Well, now we come to the final acts that are recorded of Gideon's life. And I think these are some very interesting verses, and they teach us an important lesson. The lesson being, don't let God's success go to your head. Look at verse 22 and 23. It says, Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Now I'm going to stop there for a second. And if we were to stop there, if the story stopped right there, we would say, hey, that's pretty good. Gideon turned out pretty well in the end. Well, we'll read on further in a minute. But at this point, we're saying, hey, that's a perfect answer. They came to him and they said to Gideon, they're basically asking him to be their king. To be Israel's king. And not only to be him be a king, but that he would start a dynasty so that his son and his grandson and so on would be the king over Israel. You see, his leading them into victory in battle has made him a great candidate for king in the eyes of those Israelites. Well, Gideon gives them a good answer. He says, no, I won't be your king. I won't rule over you. But he says, because Yahweh, God, is your king. He will rule over you. And so, in a sense, you read this and you say, hey, it looks like Gideon is doing what's right. He's following God and he's telling the people, you follow God. He's your king. He's ruling over you. And it seems like he's actually pointing people towards God. But there is a problem here with his answer. The reason they made their request is very clear. They requested Gideon be their king because he had saved them. The words are, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Now, who saved them? God did. And Gideon says nothing about that. He lets it stand. He doesn't correct them. Now, maybe they didn't understand that God had given Gideon this ability and told Gideon to go. Maybe they didn't know that. But Gideon doesn't clear it up. He just leaves them thinking it was him. And so in one sense, he has this good answer. But he still takes credit for what God did. There is one other problem here with Gideon's answer. Is after saying that only God is their king, that only God rules over them, he immediately starts acting like a king. Let's look at the verses, 24 to 32. And we see this. And Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered him, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornament and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian. And besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah. And all Israelite whored after it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, his other name, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives, and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of Joash's father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in the return for all the good that he had done for Israel. Now I said that right after he said, I won't be your king, that he started acting like a king. Now how did he do that? Let me explain. The first thing, he asked for part of every man's spoil from the battle. He wants all of the earrings that they had collected in battle. Now, you might think that sounds small, just little earrings, right? But when they collect them all, they collect up all the earrings that they had gathered in battle. It comes to about 43 pounds of gold. Now, giving part of your spoil was not an uncommon way to honor a king. But also, in giving that part of your spoil, it suggests that you are in some way indebted to Gideon. And it suggests that you are submitting yourself to him as well. Now, the second way that he acted like a king is that he kept all of the royal items that he took from the Midianite kings for himself. So the pendants, the ornaments, the royal fabric, all the royal items he kept for himself. The third thing, he makes an ephod. Now, in doing this, the kings often supported or sponsored religion or religious activities. And he is doing this. But in doing this, he also seems to be taking on a bit of a priestly role as well, which would also be wrong. Because an ephod, what it is, it's a type of priestly garment or a breastplate. It would be used for getting oracles from God. So when you needed to ask God a question, you would go to the priest and he would use his ephod to get an answer from God. And so he makes an ephod. And in this you would see maybe he's trying to do a good thing and pointing people towards God and saying, here, you need to come and seek answers from God. But the actual thing, in actuality, the opposite happens, and they actually start idolizing or using it as an idol and worshiping the ephod instead of God. In fact, even Gideon's family gets caught up in this because it says it became a snare to Gideon and his family. And this phrase, a snare, refers to becoming caught in adultery. The fourth thing Gideon does that acts like, when he's acting like king, is that he takes many wives and a concubine, and he has many children. And the fifth thing, which I think is the most telling thing of all, is that he named his son, one of his sons, Abimelech. And the name Abimelech, it's a straightforward Hebrew word. It means my father is king. Melech is the word for king. Av is the word for father. My father is king. So it seems that Gideon had said the right thing, but he didn't live it out. So if God does something great in your life, or if God uses you to do something great for Him, don't take His credit. Don't let it go to your head. And if people try to give you His credit, don't just be quiet about it. Let them know this was God. God did it. I couldn't do it on my own. God did it. And if you are serving in ministry, if you're doing God's work, and God gives you success, don't let it go to your head. Rather, give the glory to God. When we live by faith, we will recognize the hand of God in what we do, in the good things that happen. And we will worship Him in response. We will praise Him in response. Well, today and last week we've been talking about faith. Believing in God, trusting God, growing in our faith, and living by faith. And when we live by faith, it makes a difference in your life. How does it make a difference in your life? One, it changes you. It changes how you act, how you think, what you do. Secondly, it causes us to worship because we recognize God's greatness and the help that He has given you in your life. Third, it affects how you respond to others, even if they are critical of what you're doing. And fourth, it causes you and makes you want to follow God and trust Him even more. Even when He sends you to do things that are far greater than you are. If God asks you to do something greater than yourself, when we live by faith, we say, okay, God will do it. So here's my challenge for you this morning. And it's going to come in the form of a question. What are you doing that requires you to live by faith? How are you stepping out and saying, okay, I'm going to do this even though it's hard. I'm going to do this even though I may not know if I can do it on my own. What are you doing that requires you to live by faith? What are you doing for God that you couldn't do without His help? I want you to think about that this week and ask yourself, so ask God if He wants to use you in a significant way in this world, in this church, in your community, in your neighborhood. Well, I know the answer is yes. But you go talk to God about it. You ask Him about it. But if you do it, I'm going to tell you, you have to live by faith. If you're going to step out and do the things that God wants to do, and God's going to do great things through you, it requires faith.